All right, good evening, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. It's been a while since I've had this set up, so I'm hoping that everything works all right. I can see that there are a few people on already, and generally we end up with kind of getting more as the session goes on. So just the kind of normal housekeeping like we did for the winter series. Just bear in mind that this is completely public. So you have, everything that you share is going to be completely public. So please don't share any identifying information. Please don't share your full name. Please don't share your school, or anything like that, because there are multiple schools on here as well. And also, please bear in mind that whatever you post in the chat, and I would encourage you to use the chat, whatever you post in the chat will then be seen when this stream goes to a recording. Okay, so just bear that in mind. I can't remember when it was, but a couple of streams ago we had some people making some jokes, and you can make jokes, just bear in mind that those jokes are going to be there every single time someone plays the stream. So just remember, this is a completely public forum and there are multiple schools here. Okay. I did mention that this will be available to watch afterwards. You probably will want to go back and look at some bits because there's an awful lot to go through tonight. And you can then kind of go through at your own pace. But as I'm going through, use the chat. That's the whole point of joining when it's live instead of just watching it as a video. Please use the chat because that is there for me to respond kind of in real time to your questions as well. So we're going to be having a look tonight at themes and dramatic devices in an inspector calls. There's potential for us to look at a little bit of characters as well, but we're going to be primarily focusing on the themes, and then some of the dramatic devices, which are quite useful for some of that detailed AO2 conversation. So very briefly, we'll run through the exam structure, which usually covers a lot of the common questions about the logistics of the exam. Then just a brief kind of overview as to how to approach extracts and essays, and then those themes and dramatic devices. Okay. So extract 20 minutes, essay 40 minutes, and remember this is the first half of your Unit 2 exam. You will have heroes for the second half of this exam, and you will be assessed on AO1, AO2 and AO4. So AO1 is all about your knowledge of characters, themes, writer's craft, all of that sort of thing, and your ability to select quotations, and then AO2 is your ability to explore, analyse and talk about those quotations as well. And then AO4 for our essay along with AO1, there's a real focus there on context. So in the same way that Of Mice and Men had that real strong focus on context, this again has that strong focus. And that's quite nice, really. An inspector calls is very difficult to talk about without talking about context. So I'd imagine that you will, you'll spend, your time talking about that, whether you almost plan to or not. So that's kind of how the timings work roughly. We'd say between 15 and 20 minutes on the extract, 40 to 45 minutes on the essay. And roughly, people always ask how much should you write. The key thing is you need to write as much as it takes to answer the question. But generally, it takes about a side to a side and a half of your exam booklets to answer the extract, and then 2 to 3 sides to answer the essay. Maybe a little bit more, depending on the size of your handwriting. Okay. So tips for the extract question. You want to start by placing the extract, contextualizing it. This does not mean you need to memorize page numbers, and it does not mean you need to know exactly when acts start and finish, although I would argue that out of all of the text, it's probably easiest to work out kind of which act an extract takes place in with an inspector course, just because of the nature of the story. But what we mean by placing it is placing it within the narrative. So tell me what's just happened. Tell me what's about to happen. What's the major event that your extract is closest to? And it will be close to something, because that's generally how they choose the extracts. They think about those moments of tension. They think about those moments where that mood and atmosphere is particularly strong, and that tends to be close to some key narrative moments. So you've got then tracking through using your quotations. We tend to say around 7 to 8 quotations. But again, that's a very loose estimate and shouldn't be taken rigidly, because you could have way more quotations that are very, very short, kind of single word or phrase quotations. You could have one longer quotation that you break up into lots of bits and explore in detail. So it's going to really depend on the evidence that you're pulling out. But the key thing is that you need to track through the extract. An examiner would expect you to select evidence from the beginning, middle and end of your extract. And it's always worth looking at the opening couple of lines and the closing couple of lines, because there's a reason why the examiner has chosen the extract to start and finish at that point. So it's always worth looking there for a good quotation or moment to explore. And it talks about not waffling. Marks are awarded for the clarity of your response. So that's why we tend to promote that kind of evidence explanation sort of approach, where we're really just honing in on you're being really precise with our AO1 and our selection of evidence, and then jumping straight into that AO2 and demonstrating our close reading skills. Okay, now let's look at the essay question. So 20 marker essay question that asks us to consider the entire text. Okay, and this is exactly the same as of Mice and Men in terms of what it's asking you. And actually in terms of you thinking about your understanding of the entire text, this is what you'll be expected to do in Heroes. The key difference is in Heroes, there's no context expected. It's all about that language and narrative structure, characters, themes, etc. Whereas with an Inspector Calls, it's all about the context. So we do want to ensure that we have a strong argument throughout our essay. That again is going to make the difference for an examiner. They feel that you're in kind of control a little bit more, and it helps you to keep your evidence focused, and it helps you to keep your commentary focused as well, because quite often you'll have if you don't have that kind of overall thesis, that overall understanding and response to the question, then you will end up with kind of going off on a tangent or talking about something that isn't quite related to the question. So making sure that you have a strong introduction that answers the question in a sentence, and then you can pin everything back to that. And referring back to the question is really important. And I suppose the difference really for this compared to Mice and Men is that we are looking at both 1912 and 1945. So we're thinking about the characters and we're thinking about the audience. So two different kind of contexts here and the kind of contrasts between those. Okay, so we're about to jump into some work on themes, okay? And I'm just going to forewarn you, this is dense. There's lots of notes. So I just wanted to take a minute before I jumped into this to just mention revision technique. So I would really strongly recommend when you're faced with, if you buy revision guides or if you're faced with lots of notes, number one, don't try and write everything down. That never helps. You just end up getting hand cramp and feeling a bit miserable. And it won't all stay in your brain anyway. What you need to do is start to think about writing notes in a smart way. Okay, and this is the same across all of your subjects. And what I mean by this is you want to write notes that you can use again. You don't want notes that look really pretty but actually serve no purpose in terms of revision practice. You want notes that can then be used as a resource to help you revise. And by revise, I don't just mean rereading, because that's the least effective method of revision. So there's lots of different effective methods of revision, but three particularly good ones are teaching someone else. I believe it's called the Feynman method, but basically teaching someone else, and you do that by kind of brain dumping and then talking about that topic with someone. Another method is using the Leitner method. That's where you use cue cards, and you have different cue cards, and then depending on how well you remember them, will tell you how long it is before you look at that cue card again. And then the other method is any sort of self-testing. So things like Quizlet or any sort of retrieval quizzes, retrieval practice, anything like that. Even if it's a case of you writing some notes and then covering them with your hand and testing your memory, things like that are much more effective than just rereading the information. So that old kind of spelling test method from primary school where you cover the page and then check it and then look and see if you got it right, that again is really something that is quite effective. So in preparation or in anticipation of us going through the themes notes now, I'd recommend that you either have a bit of paper and divide it into some segments, a bit like that clock in the background there. That's a really good method for focused revision. So you can print those out online really easily. And each segment accounts for 5 minutes of time. So you just brain dump in each of those sections a different aspect of your topic. So for this, it could be each of the themes. And what that does is it gives you that focused time. So it stops you from procrastinating. It stops you from kind of drifting off and spending half an hour scrolling on your phone and then feeling like you haven't done enough revision when you've spent all afternoon revising. The other one is flashcards. So making flashcards as you go. You don't have to buy flashcards. You can just tear up some bits of paper. That also works fine. And then the other method is Cornell note-taking. Now, you should be familiar with this from Key Stage 3, but Cornell note-taking is really good because it is making notes that then are really useful for self-testing. Because you put your notes in the note-taking column, you put your keywords and key questions in the cue column, and then you summarize the whole page at the bottom. And then what you can do to test yourself is you cover up 2 of the sections and test yourself just from one of the available sections. So for example, you could cover up the cue column and the note-taking column, and then you would test yourself from the summary. Or you would, if that was a bit too difficult, you'd cover up the note-taking column and the summary, and you test yourself from the cue column with the keywords. So you would take the notes in the moment, and then you would fill in the other bits afterwards. And that again is you revising the material to create those notes. So I'm just kind of introducing that to you so that you can take your notes in a way that is kind of meaningful and means that you'll be able to return to them at a later date in a purposeful way. Okay, let's jump in then to some themes. So when we're thinking about themes, we need to think about the kinds of things that will be asked in an essay question. So if we're asked about, or we could be asked about themes, we could be asked about characters, or we could be asked about context. Now, the important thing to remember is that if we're asked about any of these, and you will be asked about context for the essay, then you need to ensure that you're referencing or thinking about the other 2. Okay, so if you were asked about, for example, as a theme, responsibility, the easiest way to talk about that is by thinking about characters that either show responsibility or a lack of responsibility, and then you link that to context as well. If you were talking about a particular character like Mrs. Burling, you think about the themes that she embodies, the themes that she shows in her kind of trajectory through the play, and then the context that she links to as well. And if you're thinking about context and writing about context, in order to actually get marks for context, you need to make sure that the context you're talking about, again, links to the characters and themes of the play, and it's not just a history essay, okay? Because examiners don't like just having a history essay, or what they like to call bolt-on context, which is where you talk about the play and then you have a separate paragraph that's about context that doesn't necessarily link or isn't woven into, or doesn't strongly connect to the characters and themes that you've talked about. Okay, so just thinking about these as interconnected is useful. And what I like to do is kind of, if I look at a question and I know that it's a thematic question, I kind of start with themes on this triangle and think, right, okay, I need to think about characters and context then, and vice versa. So just bear that in mind. We need to be thinking about the relationships between all of these in our response. Okay, let's have a look at some themes then. So, hold on. There we go. That's better. Sorry, my sound looked a little bit weird then. All right, let's jump into the first theme then. Oh, sorry. Before that, this is just an example of how you can kind of interweave some of these things together. So, you've got here the character of Mrs. Burling. And we're looking at the idea of society in 1912. And quite often, I'm sure you've seen questions already. The question will explicitly talk about context or talk about life in 1912 or whatever. So it's quite useful to think about each character's main role as a person or a construct that shows that context in some way. So we talked about this for Of Mice and Men. For Of Mice and Men, some of those characters showed what prejudice was like in the 1930s. Some of them showed how harsh life was in the 1930s. Well, it's exactly the same for An Inspector Calls. And here, an example, Mrs. Burling's main role is to highlight the class divisions in society in 1912. Okay, and then I spend my essay proving that. So you can see the green is context and it's woven into the paragraph. And we've got embedded quotations as well. And we've also got some key words that can describe the character in red. So I'm not going to read the paragraph to you. I'll leave it on the screen in a sec just for a minute for you to have a look at. But it's just to see how you can weave everything kind of together. To ensure that you're hitting both of those AOs as well. All right. So let's then finally jump into some themes. Okay, the first, probably one that you're really comfortable with and familiar with, is responsibility. And what I'll do is, there's lots of themes here now. I'm going to go through all of them and just kind of signpost where you could link them to certain characters. So this is not completely comprehensive. There might be things that you can say about a theme that I've not put on this presentation, and that's absolutely fine. This is just kind of getting you to start thinking about themes in relation to characters, and then by extension a little bit of context as well. We're not again explicitly going through context here, because I know that there's been other revision sessions. Obviously if you're not in my school, then you won't or you'll have your own arrangements, but I know that people who go to my school have had sessions on context already. So we're just kind of thinking about how we can layer themes on top of that. So here we've got responsibility, and we know that Priestley was a socialist and therefore was extremely concerned with social responsibility. And therefore the inspector adopts this view, and that view that people are responsible for each other. Burling adopts this capitalist view, and he thinks that his kind of self-interest and the idea that he is kind of looking out for his family, looking out for his business, that's really important, and that's for the good of the country. And that's a very sort of stereotypical capitalist view. It's this idea that, you know, if I've got the drive and if I'm capable enough to make something of myself, then I should look out for myself because I've earned it and I've earned my own. And that's good for the country because it means that people like me who are who are driven and who do want to make something of themselves, they are, kind of getting what they deserve. Okay, so it's that kind of idea. And the play also explores the ideas, there's different types of responsibility. So there's the wider social responsibility, and then there's also levels of responsibility towards different people at more of a personal level. So there's, of course, all the different family members and the responsibility they have towards Eva Smith or Daisy Renton. There's also the sort of responsibility that Gerald should have to Sheila, and the fact that he breaks that trust and he doesn't kind of come good on that responsibility. Also Eric and the way that he handles his forced responsibility, or not really forced in the sense that the situation became forced, but he obviously was the one that instigated the relationship between him and Eva Smith. But then the fact that she fell pregnant meant that that he then felt he had a responsibility to look after her and steal from his family as a result. So there's layers of responsibility that you can explore here. Hello in the chat. I would say hi, that's great. Maybe don't share any more personal information, but hello, good to see you. So primary theme, okay, very, very key responsibility. All right, I think every single character says it. Hang on, let me just make that a bit smaller for you. There we go. Every single character uses the words responsible or responsibility throughout the play. And it's really interesting looking at repetitions throughout a play, because remember that that a play is designed to be heard and experienced rather than read. So repetition is more noticeable, and it's more, it kind of has more importance and significance in a play because you hear it repeatedly. Okay. So the words responsible and responsibility are used by most characters throughout the play, and the inspector wanted every member of the family to share that responsibility of Eva Smith's death. So he then takes that kind of personal story of Eva Smith's life and death, and then he makes it bigger. He winds it out to wider social responsibility, because you have to remember that Mr. Burling he was on a council. Mrs. Burling is head of a charity. These people have significant roles in the society that they live in. So even though we're just hearing about Eva Smith, it's likely that they will have affected the lives of many, many, many more people. So this kind of the significance of Eva Smith's story is that there's carelessness in what they do, and that carelessness has probably affected other people as well. So this idea of the inspector saying about them being millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths, the fact that there's all these people, the entirety of the working class and beyond, and the fact that they're people too, and their hopes and dreams are tied up with ours. If you think about it, Mr. Burling would not be anywhere if it wasn't for the working class working in his factory, and Sheila would not be able to be buying her fancy dresses if there weren't people working in the shop. So the fact that these people are fortunate and wealthy and have the lifestyle they do is built on the hard work of the people in the working classes. And then the inspector gives the Burlings that warning, and again quite a significant quotation there, that if men will not learn that lesson, they'll be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. And of course this is in 1912, this is pre-World Wars, and the World Wars then happened very soon after this, where the class system started to crumble, and the fact of the matter was that you had people of different classes fighting in the trenches with each other, but you also had sort of issues with the class system where people from different classes were perhaps assigned different positions in the army with different levels of responsibility, simply based on class rather than competence and things like that as well. So responsibility is, again, a key theme and one to think about throughout the play, and it also feeds into lots of the other themes that we'll talk about in a bit, such as the younger and older generations. The fact that the younger generation will take on responsibility, they'll accept their fault in what's happened, whereas the older generation are just far more keen on just finding out who the inspector is and if he's real, and sort of calling him out for not being kind of who he says he is. So this is the sense of responsibility is important, and it is also important to remember that obviously Eva Smith has paid the ultimate price for encountering the Burlings, but the Burlings will also face consequences for the interactions that they've had with Eva Smith. Mr. Burling's going to lose his knighthood. Mrs. Burling will likely lose her position as head of the charity. Eric may well go to prison. He has committed a crime. He's committed fraud. And Gerald's and Sheila have broken up. And Sheila in particular has been clearly quite emotionally affected by this, and potentially will be struggling with guilt for a long time to come. So you'll see that there's lots of responsibility across lots of the other themes as well, and it's just thoroughly woven throughout the story. Okay, the next one's gender. So you will see this talked about in different ways in different revision guides. Some people will talk about the role of women, or just women, but gender is important in this play. You have to remember that Eva Smith is female, and that is deliberate. It's a deliberate choice to make the victim female in this story. So women in 1912 did have very few rights, and the main aim was to marry. And as well as that, because of that, and the fact that they had a lower status in society than working class men, Priestley's kind of chosen Eva Smith as this working class woman to highlight the exploitation of women in particular at the time. Although, he does then talk about John Smith and Eva Smith, so he does widen that out to the working classes in general as well. So working class women, a job was crucial. Because there was no welfare state. Remember, the welfare state was introduced later. So without a job, they simply had no money. And this meant that jobs were competitive. Therefore, when jobs are competitive, you can, if from a capitalist perspective, you can adjust working conditions, make them less favourable, because you know that if someone doesn't like it, they'll leave and there'll be someone to replace them. So there were very few jobs. Those jobs were competitive, so many women saw no alternative but to turn to prostitution, which of course we again see in the play. So when it comes to gender, Mr. Burling is dismissive of his workers, most of whom are women. And like I said, his working conditions weren't necessarily favourable, but he's paying... he says he's paying the usual rates, and if he doesn't like those rates, then they can just go work somewhere else, because again, he knows more people will just come in and take the jobs. So Gerald saw Eva as young and fresh and charming, which kind of comes across when you think about what he did. It's sort of fanciful. She's like this little entertaining, vulnerable woman that he can kind of take in and look after, and he admits to Sheila that he is her fairy prince, and what that tells us is that this was not an equal relationship. He may have in his head thought that he was helping her out, and he certainly helped her out maybe in the very short term by getting Alderman Megarty away from her. But beyond that, it was very much a relationship of unequal power. And it's a different relationship, but if you think about the relationship between Larry and Nicole, that again is a relationship, I say relationship, in in the sense of there being child. With them, it's a child and a teacher. In this sense, we've got a desperate woman and a man who holds all the power, holds the money, holds the status, holds everything. That can never be an equal relationship. She can never kind of potentially feel like she can refuse him, because he holds all of the power, and therefore it's not a relationship that is kind of based truly on love. You could also think about, though, the fact that at the start of the play, Gerald sort of holds the power with Sheila as well. He chooses the ring for her. So if you're thinking about gender and the role of women, it's a different dynamic, but there's Gerald and Eva and Gerald and Sheila, and the fact that there's a bit of a power dynamic in both of those, simply because of gender. Mrs. Burling's a bit interesting because she is very much showing what a stereotypical kind of wealthy woman would be like at this time. She's got no career of her own. She's involved in charity work. She can sort of criticise her husband at times, although this could be because, remember, she's her husband's social superior. But on the whole, she supports him and she runs the household. And she even tells Sheila that men with important jobs are often preoccupied by them, but also hints at maybe just turning a blind eye to things. So it's, when they find out about Gerald's affair, there's sort of an expectation that Sheila should just drop it and forget about it. And that is quite symptomatic of this idea that the status of women is that you've got yourself a nice man, and you should hold on to him. It could also be because Mr. Burling really, really wants this deal to go through, and he wants that more than caring about his daughter's happiness. You could argue that too. So Mrs. Burling is quite interesting, and what she also does is she highlights hers and Sheila's naivety a little bit. So when she seems really shocked that Alderman Megarty would be approaching Daisy Renton and being all kind of leery and gross, it's because she wouldn't be in those spaces. She wouldn't be in the Palace Bar. She wouldn't go out to those places because she would be in the household, because that's where women resided. They go out shopping to the nice shops and then they would go back to their home. So the women are relatively sheltered in this society. They don't, when Sheila says, "I never saw you all summer," Gerald's out working and having an affair, but Sheila's in the home and therefore would never know about that. So there's this kind of naivety that is created, this innocence that's created because the women just sort of stay in the home all the time. Mrs. Burling couldn't believe that a girl of that sort would ever refuse money. So you can see that, I've kind of said that her charitable committee was a sham. I mean, it's not officially a sham, but she's just not that great at being charitable. You can kind of tell that, can't you, that she's not that great at that. So lots of things to think about for gender here. One thing to think about and to look at, especially if you're looking for those higher marks, I would look back through the play and I'd look at the amount of times that Eva Smith is described as, or is kind of mentioned when talking about her, pretty. Look at how often the word pretty is used to talk about her. Because that, to a certain extent, changes the way that some of the characters deal with her. Gerald thinks she's obviously attractive. Eric thinks she's attractive, and that affects their kind of dealings with her. Sheila thinks that she's a pretty girl, so she'll do okay. And you'll see that the word pretty comes up quite a bit, used by a number of different characters, possibly even the inspector. And it makes you think to what extent being pretty is kind of giving you an advantage in this society. Or even if it's not giving you an advantage, is kind of seen as giving you an advantage in this society. So it's worth looking at that word pretty and how often it's repeated. Because remember, like I said, repetitions are important here. Okay. Power and authority. So, Mr. Burling, in relation to power and authority, again, you can imagine this is a really big one, right? And it strongly links to the class system, strongly links to responsibility, loads and loads of the different themes that come up. So, Arthur Burling attempts to assert his authority, but is not that great at it. So he says that he's an alderman. He says that he's been Lord Mayor. He says he sits on the council. So he's throwing his status at the inspector at every possible opportunity, but the inspector is not buying it. He also says that he knows people on the police as well. So again, it kind of shows that he, it's sort of casually throwing his status in there to be like, look at me and look at how good I am. And he's trying to use his class as a weapon and use the power and authority he has and the status he has as a weapon. And the inspector, of course, turns that back on him by, kind of stating that with this power comes responsibility. So if you are an alderman or a Lord Mayor, it's your job to make the lives of the people who you govern or the people who you represent better. So his solution to the pay dispute was simply to sack the strikers. So he's got the power to do that. He can just sack people. And of course, that's life-changing. So he has the power to change lives in a single decision. And it's important to kind of remember that and how casual they are sort of about it. So Eric uses his position to assert authority over Eva, and then he insisted on going to her room. So he's got status, but then this could also, in terms of power, be talking about physical power. So he's a man, she's a woman. He's from a home where even things like he's well fed and probably got a better nutritional profile than she does, because of the food that he is able to get to. And yes, I will put it on Google Classroom, whoever that is. I'll put it on the revision Google Classroom when we're done. So either tonight or tomorrow, and I'll share this recording as well. So he says he threatened to make a row. So there's that physical power, and then there's the status as well. And then he kept her as a mistress and used then his power in the factory to get money for her. So he then helped her by using his power. And what's interesting about this is that even though that's a crime and it is fraud and he embezzled money from the factory, what it is showing is that it is possible for these people to use their power to help those in need. Unfortunately for Eric, he only does it when he discovers that Eva's pregnant, right? Then we've got Mrs. Burling. Oh, well, I suppose it's just worth noting that £50 doesn't sound like a huge amount of money nowadays, but £50 would be a really significant amount of money in 1912, like several months' wages. Okay. Mrs. Burling thinks she's better than everyone else, and she is her husband's social superior, but she makes it very clear that she is superior to him. So she says, Arthur, you're not supposed to say such things. She's condescending to the inspector as well. Condescending is a great word for Mrs. Burling. She says, my husband was Lord Mayor. So again, she's pulling out their status and she's using it as a weapon. And again, you have no power to make me change my mind. So she's turning this into a battle of power and authority rather than a moral conversation, a conversation about good and bad, right and wrong, morality. Okay. Then we've got Sheila. So Sheila misuses her authority to get Eva sacked for no real reason because she's insecure. And that's where she talks about her being a pretty girl. And she uses kind of her status and her reputation with Millwards to get Eva Smith sacked. And she kind of accepts the responsibility, and through that gains more authority within her family. So if you look at her right at the start of the play, she's very much like a little girl. She talks about mummy and daddy, and she uses words like squiffy to describe Eric, who's drunk, and she giggles a bit. She's very young, considering that she's actually a young adult. She comes across as very young and childish. And what happens is, once she kind of goes through the almost catharsis, that kind of process of pain and release of realizing what she's done wrong, and the guilt that comes with that, and realizing the influence that she had and the impact of that, she then takes responsibility and gains authority and power within the family, because she starts to see the rest of her family members for who they are, and she starts to become kind of more in line with the inspector. So she starts to question Gerald, and she starts to stand up to her parents, and you especially see that in Act 3. So Sheila really goes on this kind of journey, and becomes much more authoritative, and that sense of authority is really interesting to look at from Sheila's perspective, because actually in being humble and taking responsibility with the inspector, she actually gains power and authority within her family unit. Gerald then really focuses on trying to out the inspector. So he goes out for a walk. Remember, both him and Eric go out for a walk. Eric is obviously thinking about what he's done. Gerald is thinking about how to tell on the inspector. So very different motives, again showing the different generations. So Gerald talks about that man wasn't a police officer, we've been had. So Gerald really takes charge after the inspector's left, and he controls the situation. And Mr. and Mrs. Burling are happy for him to do that. So he holds power and authority superficially, so kind of at surface level within the family unit, but we all know who really holds the power. It's the inspector. And he's given that power to them to decide whether to do the right thing or not, and they decide to use that chance to do the morally right thing to instead out the inspector. And then we've got, finally, Inspector Gould. So the inspector uses his authority to show that he's in charge. And he doesn't assert his authority with lots of status symbols like, oh, I was on this council and I had this job and that job. He's much more about this sense of duty and responsibility. And he just... the way that he holds himself and conducts himself when conversing with the family is how he kind of demonstrates that. So they talk about in the stage directions, he's often described as he has a massive presence. That doesn't mean that he's a big person. It means that when he's in the room, everyone notices. Like his presence is big. So it's a bit like, I don't know, if you're in class and that one scary teacher or the head teacher walks in and stands at the back. They might not physically be that big a person, but everyone feels that they're there. It's that kind of feeling. So he is controlling the situation carefully, and his power and authority stems from the way that he conducts his inquiry as well. So he talks about he's not going until he knows all that happened. He's not intimidated by Mr. and Mrs. Burling, and he doesn't. He's talking definitely. So I am not going. This will not change. Rather than, oh, I might stay until I find things out. Like, no, I'm not going. So very kind of concrete, definitive language. And he interrogates each character separately to find the truth. So with the different, with the photograph, which then they say, oh, it might be a different photograph. It might be a different girl, etc. So he talks about that and says one line of inquiry at a time. So the way that he conducts his inquiry kind of lends himself to that power and that authority. Okay. So the younger and the older generation. This one's really useful to look at. It probably wouldn't be worded like this for an essay question, but often, any essay question about change, any essay question about responsibility, any essay question about kind of Priestley looking at anything, changing for the better or becoming, people taking responsibility more, that links to this. So we can see very clearly, especially towards the second half of the play, but even during the interrogations, that the young and the old generation deal with the interrogations in very different ways. The younger generation take responsibility right from when the inspector first talks about Eva Smith. He, or Eric and Sheila both kind of show a certain level of sadness and remorse for this person, even though at this point they don't think they know them. Whereas the older generation just don't seem to care so much. And even then, if we talked about Gerald and Eric, Gerald kind of fits in with the older generation, even though age-wise he's probably between the older and the younger. Mentality-wise, the way he thinks is more with the older generation. So Gerald spends his time thinking about how to catch the inspector out, whereas Eric is spending his time thinking about what he's done. So the old will do anything to protect themselves, whereas the younger are honest and they admit their faults. Because the older generation have never been forced to examine their consciences before. You have to remember that these people have grown up in this society and they genuinely think that they've earned the right to the lifestyle that they have and to these decisions that they are making. And that's one of the reasons why they don't think that they are at fault, and therefore they don't want to apologise and they don't want to take responsibility, because they think they're just doing what anyone else in their position would do. The young do examine their consciences. They do think about how they could approach things differently. And this then leads to them changing their views later on in the play. So when that final phone call at the end of Act 3 happens, and you don't quite know what's going to happen next, quite often when that's performed, you see a freeze frame, and it's the older generation that really looks scared. The younger generation kind of look a bit defeated often, or there's a sense of, right, you're in for it now from them. But the older generation tend to look really scared because they do have quite a lot to fear. There's real consequences there. Like I said, Mr. Burling might lose his knighthood, Mrs. Burling might lose her place on the charity, and it's the damage to their reputation that is key. Reputation is so important to them, because that's how you get places, with that reputation. So they do have a lot to kind of fear from that visit of the real inspector. And the young have less to fear because they've already admitted their faults. They've been vulnerable, and they've started to sort of make that change. So they've accepted that there might be consequences, and therefore it's not as scary to them. So perhaps this might be Priestley saying that the younger generation are hope for change, and that would make sense when you think about the fact that that audience in 1945, some of those people watching may have been the age that Sheila and Eric are at that time, or a little bit younger than them, and they can kind of see how those changes have happened through decisions that people their age have sort of made. So Eric does not get on with his father. He doesn't get on with his ideas. You can see that right from the start, where Mr. Burling prefers talking to Gerald over Eric. It's partly a status thing, but it's also the fact that they just don't seem to click. Mr. Burling does not respect Eric's views. Again, right from the start, Eric talks about the way that he runs the factory and Mr. Burling shuts him down. And Eric nearly assaults his own mother. He's so cross at her. He's so angry that he feels that she was the final nail in the coffin for Eva Smith, and he was looking after Eva Smith, and it was, she went for help because she didn't want him to get into any more trouble. And therefore, Eric feels that Mrs. Burling is the reason, ultimately, that Eva Smith took her life. And because of that, his child, their grandchild, is also gone. And he feels completely misunderstood by his parents. You can see he's unhappy right at the start. He's drinking too much. He's doing... he's partying, he's not living a particularly responsible life, and that is going to stem from some level of deep unhappiness, not being seen, not being not feeling like he's being understood. Okay, so then let's jump into Mr. Burling. So he views the younger generation as immature. He calls them children, a child, you youngsters. Now, they are his children, obviously, but they are also adults. We've got to remember that. They're young adults, but they are adults. And he blames, unlike Eric, who blames his mother because she was the last person to see Eva Smith, he blames Eric for everything. So he doesn't blame his wife at all. Or indeed anyone else, including himself, even though he kind of started everything off. He says, you're the one to blame. And he thinks he was in the right. So again, he thinks that both him and Mrs. Burling were in the right for what they did. So if you remember, I said that they've grown up with this mentality. So they've made these decisions, and they feel that anyone else in their position would make decisions like this because that's just life. So they don't see that it's wrong, and they're not prepared to accept the fact that maybe some people do think it's wrong. At the start, then, so if we think about Sheila, Sheila does as she's told. We said this in Power and Authority. This is what I mean. There's quite a few overlaps with themes. So Sheila is quite childlike. She does as she's told. She's quite subservient. So she kind of steps back. She lets other people take control. So if you think about the wedding ring, she says, is this the one you wanted me to have? So again, quite a traditional thing, that the man would pick out the ring, whereas in modern day that might be a joint decision. But even in 1945 it was potentially, that would be something that potentially happened. But it's significant here because it shows that Sheila doesn't actually have a huge amount of control, and she is just sort of there and controlled by her parents. She's very obedient to her parents and to Gerald. But then that talk with the inspector changes things. She becomes more aware of her feelings, how she feels about things, how they feel about things, how that differs. And that's when she starts to interrogate them. She starts to gain autonomy, independence, and she starts to then take responsibility and try to encourage them to as well. So she says, you don't seem to have learned anything. She questions Gerald. And she, especially in Act 3, she's the one that's kind of saying, look, you've got to stop celebrating here. I know you think that you're all that because you found out that the inspector is not real, but that doesn't change the fact that what we did is real. And there was a real person that was involved with that. And she is really keen for them to kind of see that even though the inspector wasn't real, their actions still had consequences. And she stands up to her parents in a way that when we read about her in Act 1, we would never think that a girl like that would then behave like she does in Act 3 and stand up to her parents and be as assertive and be as sure of herself. But she is. And then she gives that ring back. So, that really shows the development of Sheila. The fact that she gives that ring back, she's able to stand for her own views and her own morals to the point where she says, no, I'm sorry. That security, that kind of ticket to an easy life that I could just take if I forgot about your affair, Gerald, I'm not going to take that right now. I need time to think. I need time to gather my thoughts. And that in itself is a huge deal for someone who, like we said, with the role of women, her ticket to freedom is marriage. She doesn't have another option, really, because she's not a working class woman, so she wouldn't go and work in the factories. It's marriage, or you live in your parents' house as a spinster. and that's it really. So that's a really big decision for her to make as well. Okay, let's look at the next one. I know we're going fast, so if you've got any questions, then feel free to pop them in the chat, and I'll get to them as we go. So Gerald then, like we said, he chooses Sheila's ring, and he does speak to her in quite a patronising tone, and is very surprised when Sheila kind of rejects him. Or she doesn't fully reject him. She says she just needs time to think. But, that's as good as a rejection, really. He thinks that he and Sheila should just be able to carry on as if nothing has happened. So, again, that kind of older generation of sweeping things under the rug and just saying, like, that's life, let's move on. And Sheila not kind of standing for that. And then the inspector says, no one can now say, I'm sorry, Eva Smith. So the younger generation understand this message. The younger generation can see that actions have consequences regardless of, some of the little details. But the older generation don't see that. And the final words of warning that the inspector leaves us with are the ones that we mentioned earlier, about the world wars. So the fact that we have those final words, but it's not just about the world wars. The idea of fire and blood and anguish, we could also be talking about, if we're talking about morality, that's language you could associate with hell. So the fact that, from a moral point of view, they've lost the right to, entry to heaven or whatever. But you could also then say that fire and blood and anguish is maybe a quite dramatic way to talk about the fact that the police are going to come and real crimes have been committed and reputations are going to be destroyed. And actually, for people like Mr. and Mrs. Burling, that probably does feel like fire and blood and anguish. So this is kind of saying that you learn your lesson or there's dire consequences at whatever level that we're talking about. A global level, a morality level of heaven and hell, or the kind of more domestic, small world level of you guys ruining your reputation. So, there's some ones there. So what do you say? What do I say? Questions usually ask about an inspector calls about. So examples of thematic essays. They can ask about any of these themes. What they sometimes do is they'll give you some sort of statement or quote. So they could say something like, in an inspector calls, it's clear that the younger generations are the ones who can enact change. How far do you agree? Refer to context in your response. Okay, so you could do something like that. And in that question, you can see that would be a question about the older and the younger generation, right? So you would start talking about that. The themes for an inspector calls tend to overlap quite a lot. So if you get a question, there's been quite a few about responsibility in the past, like only some of the characters take responsibility by the end of the play. To what extent do you agree? And then you can bring in responsibility, you can bring in class, you can bring in the younger versus the older generation, and you can kind of decide the characters that you're going to talk about. But at the start of this, what I said was, whatever question you get that's thematic, that's based on a theme, what you want to do is think about the characters that you can talk about. So think about what characters are vehicles to show that theme. Okay? And what you'll also find is that generally the themes lend themselves to context really well. So like gender, you're going to be able to talk about context really well there. Younger and older generation, again, you're going to be able to talk about context nice and easily here, because the older generation tend to show more capitalist views, and then the younger generation tend to, through the course of the play, demonstrate more socialist views. So you'll be able to kind of bring them in as you go. Okay. But yeah, you could get a question on any of these themes, and it's not as simple as... it's a bit like, again, of Mice and Men. It's not as simple as characters where it's, Mr. Burling or Sheila or whatever, themes tend to be kind of named differently in different revision guides, named differently in the exam. So like it wouldn't necessarily be called the younger versus older generation in a revision guide. It wouldn't necessarily be called that in the exam. It just depends on how they word it. Give you some quotes for what? Let me know what you want quotes for, and I can. But there's quotes dotted throughout all of these, if that helps. And I know that they're doing some more quotes in another session, but there are quotes dotted throughout each of these themes, if that helps as well. But yeah, let me know which theme you want some quotes for, and we can have a look at those now. So, 2 minor themes, and I'm going to say this because it's unlikely that you will get a whole essay question on this theme and the theme that I'm going to show you next. But it is worth talking about, because if you have an essay question on Sheila, for example, or Eric or Gerald or Eva Smith, then this is a nice kind of theme to weave in. And the same for the next theme. It's not necessarily something that you won't get an essay question on it directly, but again, it's a theme that's worth noting, because it is a really important theme in the play. So younger versus older generation. So quotes for the younger versus older generation. If I just go back, there's a few in here now. So you can see that there's quotes, they're in quotation marks. And there's a few by here as well. Okay. There's ones for each of the characters. Younger versus older generation, what you need to do is compare and contrast characters. So you need to think about, in Act 1, Sheila's like this, and Eric's like this. In Act 3, Sheila's like this, Eric's like this. In Act 1, Mr. Burling's like this. In Act 3, Mr. Burling's like this. And then you look at how the characters have changed, and what you'll find is the younger generation will have changed, the older generation won't have. And you can then use those quotes to compare and contrast the characters. So, for example, like Sheila saying, "You don't seem to have learned anything." She's saying that to her mother and father because they haven't learned anything. And then you can see that Mr. Burling says, "There's every excuse for what both your mother and I did, so he still isn't taking responsibility." So you will find the younger versus older generation, there's a huge overlap with loads of other themes. Responsibility, gender to a certain extent, class definitely. So there will be quotes that you'll pick out for those that will also work for this. But ultimately, if you think about the younger versus older generation, the best way to find quotes and use quotes is to just compare and contrast the characters. So think about Gerald, Mr. and Mrs. Burling versus Eric, Sheila and the inspector. Because that is going to give you those differing attitudes that you want to be talking about. Okay. All right. Let's talk about love then. So, feels like a strange theme to be talking about within Inspector Calls, but Sheila and Gerald appear at the start to be in love, right? So they are engaged. Sheila loves him. Even though she hands the ring back to him, it is assumed that she forgives him. They're amicable, aren't they? They get on. She's not saying, "I never want to see you again. You're dead to me." She's not saying anything like that. She does realise that trust is important in a relationship, but she, she's still kind of friendly with him. Burling, however, and this is what I mean about comparing and contrasting here. So Burling is very different with his idea of love. Sheila seems to be quite, it tends kind of, or it seems to come across as this sort of actual romantic love, like proper love, right? Whereas Burling's thoughts on love are quite clear through his thoughts about Sheila's marriage, which is that it's a business transaction. That's what it is. And realistically, in that society at the time, to a certain extent, it sort of was, because those women needed a stable household to move into. And, if you married into different families, then you were raising your status. So in his head, it kind of was. and he sees it as that kind of shortcut to progressing up the social and economic ladder. But then that raises the question of his wife, because his wife is a social superior. So did he marry her? We don't know this, but you can hypothesize. You can kind of give an educated guess, or at least kind of raise the question in an essay if it's relevant. Did he marry her for the status, or did he marry her for love? And does that mean that the children are in this slightly weird, dysfunctional family where no one's quite happy or talks to each other properly because actually they don't love each other in kind of the traditional sense, perhaps? Gerald and Eric don't love Eva and Daisy. Gerald loves the idea of being this fairy prince and saving Daisy, and Eric's just, it's all about lust there. Okay, so Daisy shows genuine love for Gerald because she sees him as a knight in shining armor. She sees him as this savior. He likes the idea of that, but he doesn't actually love her, and he says that he doesn't really love her, but he liked the idea of being that knight in shining armor. Eric was different. She kind of ended up in a relationship with him out of self-preservation, out of survival. And Eric, it was more of a lust thing for him. So the inspector takes the view that people should love one another as much as they love themselves. So the inspector is very Christian in that sense. It's a Christian ideal. So you have the 10 Commandments from the Old Testament, and then you have the Great Commandment from the New Testament, which is where Jesus said to his followers, love one another as I have loved you. And the inspector very much follows that idea. So very, very Christian values. And we see that again where the inspector says, we are members of one body. That is a very Christian thing to say, because Christians, again, believe that they are part of the body of the church collectively and are therefore responsible for each other. So very Christian ideals. What structure can be used for essays for higher marks? No particular structure is going to get you higher marks, but as in what I mean is there isn't kind of a framework that I can give you. Any essay framework will work, but what you want to do, easy kind of structure things that you can get in there is use the triangle introduction. You will have done that in class. So you have a general statement about the theme or the character, then a couple of points that you want to make, some more specific ideas in your second sentence, and then your third sentence of your introduction is a thesis statement. So you answer the question in a sentence. So if it was not all the characters take responsibility for their actions, then you would answer that question in a sentence in your introduction, and then you need to make sure in each of your paragraphs that you somehow link back to that sentence, because what you should do is you should spend the rest of your essay proving that statement that you've just made. So if it was not all the characters show responsibility, you could say arguably the younger generation starts to enact change through taking responsibility, while the older generation are just set in their ways. So now I need to prove that. I need to prove the older generation is set in their ways. I need to prove that the younger generation want to enact change by taking responsibility. And I need to contextualize this by talking about how that represents life in 1912 and 1945 as well. And in doing that, I'm going to get my points covered. And we're looking for really introduction, 3 points, conclusion as well. Would you need to give a certain amount of quotes in an essay question? How many quotes for each point would you suggest? We get this question every year. And you're going to hate the answer, but it's just as many as it takes for you to answer the question. There is no expectation of certain amount of quotes. What I would say is, where possible, you want to get a quote in. But yeah, there's no kind of expectation for that. Obviously, minimum 1 quote for each point, but realistically you're going to be putting more in, so like two or three, maybe even more. And that will come through practice. So practicing, not even necessarily writing out essays, but writing essay plans is really useful. So a good way to write an essay plan is you do your introduction as note form, and then in sort of the margin of a bit of paper, you write sort of almost like your topic sentence. And that's sort of the point that you're going to make in that paragraph. And then next to it, you list the quotes that you would use. And you'd expect to probably get 2 to 3 per point, but then any more you can get in there's a bonus as well. The important thing with quotes is that you do something with them. You don't just dump them in there. You make them work for you. You help them. You use them to help build your argument. Okay. All right. This one is probably a strange one. You might not have seen this before, and I know that we're over time, so I'm going to be as quick as I can here. Time. Again, you won't get an essay on time, but it's a really useful theme to have up your sleeve just in case you want to bring something original to the table. So Priestley draws on ideas about time in the play. And actually, time appears loads. And that's why it's important to actually talk about the weird sense of time that goes on in the play. So here, the characters go full circle. So the story goes, the story kind of finishes where it starts, which is kind of strange, because then it's like, oh, has any time passed at all? Aside for the characters, within that room, within that house. Characters are given a chance to see consequences of their past actions. Now, normally in a production, you wouldn't see flashbacks. If you've watched the TV version, the BBC TV version, then obviously they do flashbacks. So that's another use of time. And that's classed as a performance, so you can talk about that. But generally, it's just them talking about their past actions. And then that kind of interrogation by the fake inspector means that when the real inspector comes after the end of the play, that's going to make them change how they react to him, potentially. So we are then left to kind of think about how each character is going to respond. And that again is just quite a useful thing to think about. If these characters were interrogated again by the inspector, what would they say? What would they do? So time is just a very useful theme to look at. I think there's some sort of someone did a count. There's something like nearly 100 references to time by different characters across the play. So in the same way that responsibility is mentioned a lot, time is mentioned a lot as well. So like I said, a minor theme. You wouldn't just get an essay on this because you can't really talk about context very well with it. But it is quite useful to have to sort of weave into things, or to just think about things like narrative structure, and the structure of the play as a whole. Okay. The ideal number of sides to write for an essay. So generally your pink exam booklets are slightly smaller than A4. So we would say you need to have between 2 and 3 sides for an essay for it to have any sort of level of detail to get a C or above. Many people write a lot more than that, which might feel kind of not doable in the exam. But in what you'll find is, and I'm sure you've found this with your Mice and Men, the adrenaline in the exam means you end up writing more than you probably would if you were practicing otherwise. But you don't need, 8 or 10 sides, because you have to balance your time with moving on to heroes. Because some people absolutely ace Inspector Calls and write degree level theses on a character, and then they forget heroes. So, you could absolutely ace Inspector Calls, but it's only ever going to be worth half the marks. So you have to balance your timing there to make sure that you move on to heroes. But yeah, I usually would expect kind of 3 sides in the pink exam booklets. And remember, you can plan, and you should plan in your booklets. So you plan and then you draw a line through it, ready for when you kind of draft your essay then. Okay. And if you don't draw a line through it, generally the examiner knows what's a plan and what's not, as long as you leave a few lines between your plan and your draft as well. Okay. Class, I think we're nearly at the end now. So for class, Burling, and you'll see this links so much with power and authority. It links with older versus younger generation. So we'll zip through this nice and quickly. Again, there's lots of quotes here that you can steal and kind of use. These are not necessarily the only ones, but this may be a nice start for you. So Burling boasts about class and discriminates against the lower classes. He cares more about his social standing than his own family, which becomes, it's very clear right from the start, right? So he implies the inspector is of a lower class when he says, I don't suppose you did play golf. And if you don't come down sharply on these people, so you'll see that Mr. and Mrs. Burling in particular will try to use language to dehumanize Eva Smith and generally the lower classes, right? So girls of that sort, these people, trying to distance themselves from those, almost like they're a different species. So you'll notice that in a lot of the language when they're talking about the working classes, that's how they talk. So he, Mr. Burling is very keen to kind of push the idea of his status, partly because he's worked his way up, right? So he hasn't been born into these upper classes, so he is kind of keen to show where he is now because he wasn't always there. And we've said this a number of times tonight, but he just sees it as natural that people should become wealthy by exploiting the working classes. That's just what is done. And if you can do it well, then why not? So that's kind of Burling and his attitude. There's so many lovely quotes from Act 1 that you can pull out. The bees in a hive quote is great. Bees in a hive and all that nonsense. These Bernard Shaws and H.G. Wellses. All those bits where he's kind of pushing socialism to one side and kind of emphasising the importance of looking after one's own and their family. Gerald is a notorious womanizer. So he has the upper class approach to using lower class girls for pleasure. So we talk about Alderman Megati, but it's kind of an unspoken, but kind of everyone knows about it, that the Palace Bar is where you go to pick up these working class girls for pleasure, and Gerald knows that. Like he's obviously part of that culture. Eric is well educated, so he's been afforded, the private schooling, all of that sort of thing, and the prospect of the class that he's been born into, but he acts like a spoilt young man. And he just enjoys himself. So he goes out, he parties, he drinks too much, right? So his parents are quite disparaging about him. They're quite rude about him and the fact that that's kind of who he is. You can explore that in detail about why Eric is the way he is, whether it's just neglectful parents that just don't get him, or whether he's really spoilt and it's just an example of how even with money and class you can still not be a great person if you don't have morals. So it could be that as well. So he has more money to spend and time to spare. Let me just check the chat. Yeah, so people often say this, kind of that balancing act, and the timing is important. So you want to spend about an hour on your Inspector Calls section, an hour on your Heroes section. So we'll do a walking talking mock. Again, this is if you're in my school. We'll do a walking talking mock after Easter, just so you get a feel for the times. So you can balance the texts, because that's probably the only thing that's a bit tricky for this exam. Otherwise, it's a lovely exam. For most people, this is their best exam out of all of them for literature. Because you're right, obviously there are two texts, you're trying to balance both of them. It feels like a lot to remember, but because they're both so different, and in particular, because An Inspector Calls is a play, you'll find that you'll memorize stuff without even realizing it. So you're doing all the right stuff. You're turning up to revision. You're making the notes. You're doing the things. So as long as you keep doing that, and in particular, like I said right at the start, strong revision practice. Keep self-testing. Test each other. Quiz each other. Teach each other. Like give each other a minute to talk about a character non-stop. That sort of thing genuinely is more useful than just writing out loads of notes. And I know they look really pretty, but genuinely they're just not that helpful compared to some of these other methods. So if you really like doing them, then go ahead. But just there's better ways to revise if you want to kind of work smart, not hard. What day is it? Do you know? I think it's the 20th of May off the top of my head. I would double check that with your teacher, but I think it's the 20th of May. So it's always the last week before May half term. So you've got about 6 teaching weeks left because we've got Easter in between. Okay. All right. Sheila only cares about her status in society and the items the upper classes possess at the start of the play. So she looks at the ring. She likes all the glittery things. She likes the nice dresses, blah, 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 blah. But she does show sympathy for her father's employees. So you can see she humanises the working classes, whereas Mrs. Burling and Mr. Burling dehumanise the working classes. So when we were talking about older versus younger generation, really nice way to get some detailed comparison in there and show off your top band analysis is to find a quotation from Mrs. Burling or Mr. Burling talking about the working classes, girls of that sort, those sorts of quotes, and then finding one from Sheila saying something like, these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people, because she is humanising them, and Mr. and Mrs. Burling dehumanise. So then Mrs. Burling, very aware of her class. I mean, she was born into that class, but she's very aware of it. And she corrects Mr. Burling on the way to conduct himself at times. And then the idea of her abusing her social status because she uses that position in the charity to, kind of decide who gets support and who doesn't. And for some people, that's obviously life and death. So the inspector seems to transcend classes. He doesn't seem to belong to any class in particular. And that's deliberate, really, because he's kind of meant to be a little bit enigmatic and mysterious, but he sympathises with the working classes and he's unimpressed by Burling's claims to social importance. So the stuff that might impress other people, that Mr. Burling says does not impress the inspector. Okay, so nearly at the end. We've got morality here now. Now, again, not one that you would necessarily get as a direct question, but definitely something you can include in your essays. So morality, good and bad, right? So what characters could be considered moral? So these are just some things for you to think about, really. So a reading could be that Gerald is a moral character. He certainly views himself as having strong morals. However, the fact that he quickly forgets Daisy, although he seems to genuinely care for her, he quickly forgets Daisy, and his attentions turn back to Sheila, makes you question the legitimacy of his feelings and his actions. And then Sybil Burling, Mrs. Burling. So she prides herself on maintaining this reputation, and she does that by volunteering in a women's charity. And in the sense that women have to conform to certain expectations, they have to be certain things, say certain things, do certain things. In her head, she probably made a moral choice that Eva Smith has come in. She's lied about her identity. She's pregnant and is trying to, in her words, sort of blame it on the father. And this doesn't sit right with her, so she won't give her the money. And in her head, that's a moral decision. However, in the inspector's eyes, in the audience's eyes, it's a very immoral decision, because the whole point of that charity is that she is a woman in need, and Mrs. Burling is not seeing past the little things to the fact that she is a woman who is really in need, and instead she just, with her prejudices, rejects her. So there's that sense there of that balance between good and evil. And I'm sure that you've done this in class, but the idea, we talked about the idea of the Christian values in the play, and in particular some of the things the inspector says, but also you can link some of the 7 deadly sins to the Burlings. So I'll just leave this on the screen for a minute so that, again, if you watch this back, you can pause it and see. But we've got gluttony, the Burlings having that opulent dinner, the really fancy dinner with dessert and champagne when you've got people starving on the streets. Arthur Burling is guilty of being greedy. You could argue that he's kind of got avarice, that kind of word avarice is quite nice to use there as well. Envy. So Sheila is jealous of how pretty Eva Smith is. Sybil Burling is a very prideful character, and she's too proud to kind of put her prejudices aside to consider Eva's needs. And then, of course, we've got lust from Eric and Gerald, and you might connect them to some other sins as well, but they're just some examples there. And then there's that quote from the inspector: "We are members of one body." So the great commandment that and the very Christian ideal that is shared by the inspector. Okay. So, and I appreciate this has been a very intense evening. This is the last couple of slides, I promise. This is just a quick reminder, basically, to look at your stage directions. Make sure with a play you look at your stage directions, okay? And that includes when characters are being introduced, because Priestley has quite long and detailed stage directions, and it helps for us to see how he describes them and what he's saying about them, because that gives us an indication as to the characters and how they're being played. So Mrs. Burling being rather cold, Sheila being a pretty girl, Gerald's an attractive chap, Eric's half shy, half assertive. So, that gives us an indication of what they're thinking, and it gives us an indication of how they're kind of meant to be played. In addition to that, I know that you will all have done the lighting and the lighting moment. So the pink and intimate lighting that turns cold and harsh when the inspector enters, kind of like they are, being interrogated. And then there are some sound effects. So think about like a phone ringing or the doorbell ringing or something. But they signify really big dramatic moments in the play. So if you get an extract that has sound effects in it, then it might be worth using those and talking about them. And again, this is for really top band stuff. So top band structure, we want to talk about punctuation. Priestley frequently makes use of the dash to show a character's emotional state. So in performance, if you're reading a play as an actor, then the dash is kind of telling you that you have to deliver those lines with that pause in there, and it means that you speak in that sort of slightly disjointed way. So the way you talk doesn't flow. It's sort of stop-starty, and that could be because you're so emotional that you're trying to hold back tears. It could be that you're panicking. So the context will tell you what emotion that is, but there'll be some sort of emotion behind that, and that can be quite useful if you're talking about either mood and atmosphere. Because if a character is fearful or if a character is upset, then obviously that's going to affect the mood and atmosphere. Or it could connect to a character's kind of development. So if Sheila's really upset at a certain point, then that could be a turning point for her taking responsibility. So I think the bit where she talks about being in Millwoods, there's loads of dashes in that, because she's slowly coming to terms with the fact that, like, as she's talking, she's slowly realizing, oh god, like, I did this, like, I was the one that got her sacked, and then this other stuff happened. Like, so it could be quite useful for kind of exploring a character's emotional journey as well. in addition, exits and entrances and dramatic irony. So if you read the first act, then you should know dramatic irony. All that stuff that Burling says is dramatic irony. And then the exits and the entrances are consciously done. So we've talked about this throughout tonight. Gerald and Eric exit, and then come back in at strategic points. So it's important that Mrs. Burling goes on that big rant about how the father should be held responsible, he should be locked in prison, and all of that stuff at the end of Act 2. With Eric out of the room, it's more dramatic that he's out of the room, because we've all worked out who the father is except for Mrs. Burling, and then Eric comes back in, and his physical entrance is kind of brings that tension to its peak. So exits and entrances, again, if you get those in extracts, are really useful and important to check out. And just a couple of other extra bits, a little bit of thinking about symbols, thinking about strong contrasts. We've talked about contrasts tonight quite a bit, and then cliffhangers. So thinking about how the acts end, because each one of them ends with a bit of a cliffhanger. So again, if you get an extract that's towards the end of an act, it can be really useful to think about the effect of stopping the narrative where Priestley's decided to. And thinking about, when we think about the characters, we need to think about them as dramatic constructs. So they're not real. The only person that's real in this situation is Priestley, and he's using these characters as vehicles to share a message with us. And there is no greater example of that than the Inspector, because the Inspector often shares Priestley's views, but all the other characters do that as well. So thinking about the order the characters are questioned, the pace of events, how the plot is moved along, it's all controlled by the Inspector and therefore controlled by Priestley. So the fact that he voices Priestley's socialist views, and the fact that he controls that narrative very carefully with the photograph, all of those things feed into that tension and the way that the narrative unfolds as well. Okay, I know that I've taken quite a few questions throughout the session, but I'll just leave a minute to see. I know that we've gone way over, but I'll just leave a minute and just see if there are any other questions that you want to pop in the chat. I know it's been a really intense session. So like I said, the recording will go up as soon as the stream is done. The recording will go up, so you'll be able to access that and have a look back through all the notes. And I think YouTube automatically puts the chapters in as well. So hopefully you'll be able to kind of skip to the bits that you need. So it'll just be quite a good reference for you. We haven't gone through all the characters in loads of detail today, but hopefully through the themes, we've covered the characters quite a bit. And I know that there are sessions on characters with some other teachers, again, if you're part of my school, coming up as well. So okay. So if you do have any questions, please share them in the chat. That's all I've got to share with you for this evening. Just to make you aware though, for the essay, is it just mostly context and the time? Do you mean the theme or time? So yeah, the essay, in the same way as of Mice and Men, the essay context is really important. It's worth 67%, I think, again. So you're measured on AO1 and AO4. AO1 is all about your knowledge of characters and themes and your ability to select quotations to back that up. And then your context is obviously important in there. So making sure that it's relevant context, that it links to the argument that you're making. And it's really important to kind of also have that through line, that argument, the overall argument, rather than just sort of talking about anything. So making sure that at the start you set out your introduction and you answer the question, and then you spend the rest of your essay kind of proving what you've kind of answered. So looking at 1912 and 1945. So you won't need, it's not a case of, you don't need to mention 1912 and 1945 every time you talk about context, but you do need to have an understanding of both, because, for example, if you write about Sheila being ridiculed by Mr. Burling, and he's laughing at her and saying that she's overreacting in Act 3, you might say that a 1945 audience would sympathise with Sheila because they understand the more socialist views, the idea of welfare and socialism and looking out for each other. Whereas obviously Mr. Burling, as a quintessentially 1912 gent, thinks she's ridiculous. You do not need to add context to the extract. Don't do that. The only time where context would be useful for an extract is if you are using it very, very, very briefly to make a point about something in the extract. You're not marked on it, so there's just no point. AO1 and AO2, it's all about language analysis. So think about dramatic devices, narrative structure, punctuation, word choice, look at stage directions, all those dramatic devices I shared at the end. That's all quite useful for extracts. Okay. Feel free to add any more questions to the chat. Just to make you aware, I know that my head is covering 2 of the dates for the sessions, but I think they're for language anyway. So obviously there's again, if you're part of my school, there's other sessions that are running in person, and we've got our Instagram live sessions that again are all saved to our feed once they're done. But you can see here that we've got a literature session for heroes in a couple of weeks' time, and then we've got a paper walkthrough, both of those online at 7 p.m. So those lives will be scheduled on the YouTube channel, so you can obviously sign up and be notified for those if you want to join me again. Question: no, don't do that. So do not compare Heroes and an Inspector Calls. There are ways you could compare them theoretically, like just as a conversation, but don't do that in the exam. You think of them as almost 2 mini exams back to back. So an Inspector Calls is an hour, you just focus on that. Heroes is an hour, you just focus on that. So just think about them like that. An hour for Inspector Calls, an hour for Heroes, 2 mini exams back to back. So you can see that there's three literature sessions. Have I said that right? 1, 2, 3. Yes, we've just done the first one, and then there's Heroes, and then there's the paper walkthrough that we will go through about a week before the exam as well. You'll also notice the massive QR code. That is a link to the podcast. So I know that most of you are aware of the podcast by now, but there are podcast episodes on an Inspector Calls context. There's all the characters, all the themes, and then there's also some stuff on there for Heroes, a little bit less for Heroes, but there are characters and themes on there for Heroes, and there's episodes, they are talking about Unit 1, but there are episodes on how to approach an extract and an essay. So for an Inspector Calls, even though we're talking about Of Mice and Men in it, the advice is exactly the same. It's slightly different for Heroes, but it's exactly the same advice for an Inspector Calls. So you can check that out as well. Obviously that's just broken. It breaks things down a little bit. So each theme is discussed individually. And there's, again, quotes and characters and things on there that you can access. So you can subscribe to that, and you can subscribe to this as well to be notified. Whenever I say that, people always ask if I make money from it. No, I don't. Okay. I'm just sad and I like this sort of thing, right? And I know that it's quite useful for people who can't stay after school or who, I don't know, like to study at this time. So if you want to be notified, then go on there. And I think that's pretty much it. Thank you very much for joining me. I know people have been dipping in and out. Thank you very much. A lot of people have told me that. We've been dipping in and out, and I hope this has been useful. I know it's been a really long one. These ones always are, but the idea is that you can ask questions as you go, and then you can watch it back and have a little bit of a reference point to go forward. So after that marathon session, you all deserve a drink and a lie down, and then a fresh start maybe tomorrow. If you are in my school, then feel free to come and find me to ask questions if there's a question that you have that you didn't want to ask on the chat, or there's the question box on the shared revision Google Classroom, so you can ask any questions there, and then we'll hope to address those either through the Google Classroom or through your revision sessions as well. Okay, and if you want us to cover anything in particular in revision sessions, then again you can use that question box or just come and find me or any one of your teachers as well. All right, I am going to go and have a cup of tea and a lie down now. So I will see some of you around school tomorrow, and maybe see some of you in lessons later on in the week. All right, thanks very much for joining me again, and the stream will be up very soon. Goodbye everyone. Bye-bye.